Is coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments on whatever page you may happen to be watching on, and they will show up here in my chat room, and we can talk directly. And I hope you're having a lovely day. I hope you've had a lovely week. And our subject today is roundup of stories from the week. And this is the first time I've done this subject. And so we'll kind of see how it develops. My thought is that I will do it on a regular basis going forward, depending on how people like it. And if you have any stories that you have seen that you would like to comment on, please feel free to bring them up. And hello to Bimby in the chat room. It's good to see you. Um, I myself, and hello to Antonio in the chat room. I'm probably going to be talking both about some of the stories that I have covered this week on the show, and some that I have seen elsewhere. Um, One that I saw elsewhere, and I've had a little trouble finding the original story to remind myself, but it's the idea of a neural implant that theoretically allows people to navigate the internet using only their mind. And there seem to be several of these under development. One is called Neuralink, which is being created by Elon Musk and requires a microchip the size of a coin to be implanted inside the brain tissue. Another one is called the synchron switch, which is thought to be less invasive. And if I understand correctly, it is inserted through the bloodstream and makes its way to the brain's major cortex, where it, I guess, takes up its home and works in that way. And the idea of both of these is really for people who are paralyzed or otherwise unable to interact in a normal way, to be able to interact in a technological way. And that's certainly a very interesting development. I gather both of these two, and perhaps some others, are in a testing phase at this point. Um, and personally, I think that for a person in that position, particularly a person who is paralyzed, that could be a very good thing. Um, I've never been paralyzed as such, though I have had friends who were, and people I've worked with who were quadriplegic or otherwise with very little or no motion. And I would think that would make life much easier. I remember the first time I met one of my friends who I usually refer to as Lawyer Mike. He reminded me of a cyborg because he was hooked up to all of his electronic equipment when I first met him. And the computers that he was able to use, the voice activated software he was able to use, were a great improvement in his life. They offered him huge capabilities he did not otherwise have. If in addition to his physical paralysis, he had perhaps not had that ability to speak and use voice operated software, it would have been a um, much harder situation for him. And um, I think that something like this would be very good for a person in that position. Now, Bimby says, I agree that it would be good for that purpose, but my fear is that they would push this as a tool on everybody. And of course, they're going to. And hello to Mary in the chat room. Um, like any other technology, once it's out of the bag, it will be everywhere. Now, hello to Christine. And it will be a few years before it's really out of the bag. Um, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure what to think about it, but I am fairly sure that it certainly is on its way. And I imagine culture is going to adapt itself. And hello to Mark in the chat room. Um, I'm a great believer in the idea that nothing is invented and not used. That doesn't necessarily mean it becomes common. I can think of a number of things which have good uses that never really became common. And the voice activated software I was just mentioning is one of them. And I think everyone's phone has that option, but many people I know don't use it. I don't use it. Um, and this may be the same way. It may be something for those who do want it. I can see a lot of positive uses for it personally. And I can see negative uses for it too. It's interesting talking about different stories. Today on Sir Edward's page was a question of whether the concept of power is equal to abuse. And it was very hopeful to me to see people's answers because most people said no. Power is how we get things done. Power is what we use to get out of bed every morning. How we achieve our goals in life. Um, but one of the comments that I made, the answer that I made, pointed out that all these things um, in that discussion, power and politics and ego, all terms that I referred to, can be either positive or negative. Um, None of these is inherently negative, but all of them certainly can be, and all of them can be very positive as well. Um, Power is simply the way you get things done. If you have no power, again, you're not going to get out of bed in the morning. If you have no power, your phone is going to die. If you have no power, you're not going to be broadcasting a show at noon. And hello to Reverend Charles in the chat room. Um, there is nothing inherently negative about the concept of power, but there are certainly times and people who will abuse it. Like everything else, it does not exist in a vacuum, and it can be used either positively or negatively. Same with politics. Politics is basically the art of making decisions in groups and organizations. And at its best, it's the art of diplomacy and compromise. And it's the way that we avoid physical and emotional violence when people are using it well. But of course, we all know there are people who use it in negative ways, but that doesn't make it a negative concept. And with the concept of ego, ego is simply your view of yourself. It's your self, your identity as a self. Um, your sense of individuality, your sense of who you are. And a healthy ego is a wonderful thing for a person to have, a healthy, well-balanced ego. A damaged ego can be very negative. Unfortunately, a lot of people only look at the negative meanings of these things. Um, Now, Antonio in the chat room says, I'm all for integrating advanced technology in daily life. I'd love to have the glasses Iron that Iron Man has that gives a display in my field of view to control other tech in my environment. But I want to be able to take the thing off of me at the end of each day. And I think that's certainly reasonable. And, I think when we're talking about something like these neural implants, right now they're focused at people who are in need of constant assistance. I don't know that that's the form they'll necessarily take um, when they come into wider use. Um, but I will tell you, if I could have a neural implant that allowed me to translate from one language to another um, without having to physically learn that language, I don't know that I would have any objection to that. I think I would find that extraordinarily helpful in navigating the world. Um, I think I'd want to have it exist for a little while to see its pros and cons. Um, but I could see uses in that. I could see it better, however, if I could take it on and put it off. Um, but I don't know if 50 years from now, were I still here, or rather, assuming I have come again, that I'll necessarily feel that way because so much may have changed, and how we look at these things may change. Um, well, when I think about my great grandmother, Caroline, one of the stories I remember about Caroline is that every year she would winter with my grandparents. Every fall, she would make a big progress to their house with many of her belongings, often saying she was going to stay indefinitely, and in the spring she'd go back to her own home um, and stay there for the summer. But one of the things that is relevant about this is that her home had no electric, and she was unwilling to get it because her theory was she'd lived with it as it was for her entire lifetime. She had never had electric in her home and did not miss it. But in the winter, when the days were shorter and darker, it was very nice to be in my grandparents' home where they had it. But she did not herself see the need to have it in the long days of summer. Um, I cannot really imagine being without electric, but then I use it for things great grandmother would never have thought of. I can't imagine that what I'm doing literally right now was in her living mind. Now, as a spirit, has she spoken about this sort of thing? Absolutely. Long before it existed in this physical world, although not necessarily in terms I understood at that time. But in her lifetime, I don't think anything like this would have occurred to her. And I do not imagine that the things that we'll be dealing with 50 years from now really would necessarily occur to me. Now, Mary says, if I could have something that would bypass the neuropathy and arthritis in my legs, I would definitely consider it. That's a perfect example. Because if you think about it, is this really different from, say, a pacemaker? I do not have a pacemaker, but I spent a year thinking I was going to, um, until it turned out that medications were able to improve my physical condition enough that I did not need it. Um, but if I had needed that pacemaker, even though it was a physical intrusion into my body, would it have been bad? Um, I am sure there are people who have thought that it would be. Um, and I don't know how I would have felt about it if I were looking at it being developed before it was in use. As it was, although I certainly wasn't looking forward to it, and I'm much happier not to need it, I certainly would have gone ahead and gotten it because so many people have used it successfully. And I think, particularly when dealing with medical issues, this kind of implant can be a very positive thing. One thing that I remember, and this has been from many years ago, and now I believe has many uses, many years and many users who have had good success with it, was a neural implant to help people with certain kinds of blindness to achieve partial sight. And what's this been, 20 years, maybe more than that, that this has been in use. And I cannot imagine but that this is a good thing for a person in that situation. Um, I would imagine it makes life much easier. So when I look at this, I'm not entirely sure how I would feel about it being an everyday thing, but I am hesitant to just think that it would be bad. I I think it certainly could be good, and I would want to see how it plays out. Is it going to become an everyday thing? I think there's no question that it will in the passage of time. But does that mean everyone will be doing it? Oh, that's another question. And not everybody has a pacemaker. Not everybody has voice technology on their equipment. Some I know some people who love touchscreen computers, and I have a touchscreen phone. But my desktop that I use for broadcasting is definitely not a touchscreen, and I did that quite intentionally. It is not what I wanted. So I think that we will continue to have our choice of how we apply this for quite a long time. But there may be a point at which it becomes so ubiquitous that no one chooses to forego it, or alternatively, it may not work out, and it may not transcend the medical market. but I think that is an interesting thing for us all to be watching, and I think we should be paying attention to it. I think we'll be hearing a lot more stories about it. And is it going to be a good thing? Um, I think that if you're in the place where you need it, it will be. And its other applications, I think, remain to be seen, but I can see how they might be. Um, but then I do tend to be very open to um, ideas of technology. Now, other wares in the news this week. We'll just call that a neologism. But otherwhere in the news this week, most stories have been about politics. And yesterday, we were talking about one of those, the recent IVF ruling um, on in vitro fertilization in Alabama, which ruled that a fertilized embryo, even outside of the human body, had the same rights as any fully developed human being. And we filled a full half hour with that story. And of course, the biggest change in that story is that the Alabama legislature fell over itself to immediately draft a law to counteract that, to protect IVF workers, um, and to counteract the unexpected application, though obvious application of their fetal personhood law. As I was saying yesterday, I'm not a believer in the concept of fetal personhood. And I make a differentiation between something that is alive and something that is an individual life. Um, but in a case like this, it's a very complicated situation when you actually look at everything it affects. A lot of the people who are politically pursuing the concept of fetal personhood have very narrow vision on what they're doing versus its potential effects. Leaving aside how we feel about what they're trying to do, if we look at its potential effects, it goes a much farther distance. Um, and the potential for allowing a fertilized embryo consisting of only a few cells, frozen in a refrigerator, to have the legal rights of any given person, um, really opens some very bizarre scenarios, including the one that brought the case, um, which was um, a couple seeking to launch a wrongful death suit over the loss of such an embryo, which would not certainly have ever been a normal thing to do. Now, Lady Kai in the chat room says most stories are about politics, especially when it's election year, and quite a few of those I'm going to avoid. Um, Everybody has their own opinion, and for the most part, unless it impacts the pagan community as such, I'm probably going to not get into it. But I will deal with issues around Christian dominionism. And hello to Steve in the chat room. And that was a big part of our conversation yesterday. Christian dominionism, or a common term for it now, is Christian nationalism. The idea that well, basically that a particular kind of Christianity, because it's not even all kinds of Christianity, is the only acceptable path for people to follow, and using politics to enforce this. The idea of having a quote Christian nation. Now, if you look at European history, you'll see war after war in so-called Christian nations over what kind of Christian to be. Um, Huge numbers of fatalities, violent political persecution. There's a reason that when this country was created, shortly after the end of the religious wars in Europe, there was a major effort to emphasize religious freedom and plurality, and the concept of a separation of church and state, because they remembered, in some cases, literally remembered the effects of this kind of conflict. And the early founders of the country were actually very clear. They were not founding any sort of established church. That is to say, any sort of national church, because if you're not familiar with the term, established church means national church or national religion. And some of them were quite explicit in saying that. And I think that although many parts of the world today um, do follow this concept, I think it's been one of the one of the most important precepts of this nation historically, and I'm amazed by how many people want to throw it out. But then that minority has always been here. If we go back to Thanksgiving, and we remember my shows at that time, one of the things that I talked about is I really, really do not like to deal with that whole pilgrim myth at all. I don't regard those as good people who deserve to be remembered in any positive sort of way. Um, the idea of a festival of Thanksgiving, absolutely. But I view it in very different terms, and I absolutely do not reference um, that that mythological origin, which really has very little to do with the origin of that holiday in terms of its actual practice. It's really a very traditional um, festival in the fall part of the year. And Lady Kai in the chat room says, I would be rich if I received $1 for every time someone mentions the US motto, "In God We Trust," without even realizing that that was not even the US's original motto. Yeah, and in my opinion, never really should have been. Our proper motto was "E pluribus unum," one out of many, which I think certainly speaks much more to the principle of um, government that we claim that we follow, and is much more sensible for a government such as ours, in my opinion. But there was a huge movement, particularly in the 1950s, much as there is now, to try to force a certain form of Christianity on everyone, regardless of what background they came from. At that time, they were using it in contrast to communism, which was a very popular um, philosophy at that time. And um, they got a number of things through based on that opposition that really have nothing to do with it, um, and which are now being used for other purposes. And I think that as members of a minority religion, um, which we will call paganism, uh, to be simple, and I think we all understand the concept of paganism as a group of related religions, even though some of them don't like to use that term or want to use other terms or whatever. But we understand the meaning for this conversation. We need to be very mindful of doing everything we can to support religious pluralism because, it's our rights and our civil status that we're talking about. Um, I cannot imagine how anyone in the pagan movement can support anyone who advocates Christian dominionism as part of their campaign. And yet I've seen people do it. Um, and all I can say is, you get what you pay for. Um, it is, well, as I said yesterday, I think that we've come past the point that we can head off the um, the fight over Christian dominionism. They have won the larger portion of their goals already. Now it's a matter of how do we survive and turn it back. And if we wish to survive, if we wish to prosper, if we wish to be anything other than a marginalized minority, we really need to be looking at how we can work to turn this movement back. They used a well-established plan over the course of 50 years to get to where they are. And I think that in the end, we're going to need to do basically the same thing, and it may take us just as long. I think right now, our biggest concern is how do we not lose the status that we currently have? Because you know that many of these people are going to try to come for it. Anyone old enough to remember the Helms Amendment, which I frequently refer to, or any number of other situations in the last 50 years where um, prejudice against paganism has caused um, our rights to be held back or invalidated, knows that that is part of the Christian dominionist agenda. Anyone who remembers the Pentacle Quest and the fact that in the end it was admitted that the only reason we had to fight so hard to allow um, Wiccan service people to have a pentagram on their tombstone was because of religious prejudice, knows that this is a very important issue that comes up again and again. So obviously it's coming in the future. And we cannot, in my opinion, afford to simply turn our eyes away from it. So that's a subject you'll probably see me come back to again and again, as I have done over these last 40 odd years. You will see in everything I've done coming back to this subject, particularly since I've worked with Sir Edward, but even in the time before that, this was always a matter of importance to me. In fact, the Five Mystic Secrets, which my mother wrote, was about this same subject in the end. It was written in response to the rise of what was called the New Right, which is Christian dominionism. Um, it has been a defining aspect of my lifetime, and I think it would be less a defining aspect of the next generation if more people in our movement had realized it was a defining aspect in the last generation. But that does bring us near the end of our half hour. I want to remind you of the Pagan Power class by Ed the Pagan tomorrow um, at pagan.world/pagan-power, available to all supporters of Pagan World, and also by invitation to my personal patrons at Patreon, um, and perhaps some other people I may not be aware of, but it's a class well worth taking if you're concerned about the future. If you're concerned about how to get things done in a positive and successful manner, I cannot too strongly recommend this class. And if you want more information about it, you can find it at Sir Edward's page or on my page or at Pagan World or various other places. Or you can go back to our broadcast on Tuesday, where Ed the Pagan was our guest talking about this class. But I think you'll find that it will discuss concepts and um, and actions which are highly relevant to the things we face both as individuals and community. So with that, we've come to the end of our half hour. I want to thank you for joining me, and let us close with our prayer as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to help keep us open to all the things happening in our world, and help us to bring an insightful eye to the many developments in the world around us. Help us to choose what we want and reject what we do not as we go forward, so that we can have the lives we desire. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks. And knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may the blessing be upon you now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and I will see you on Monday And until then, may the blessing be upon you now